Well, welcome again one more time to Encounter Church. Glad that you're here, especially glad that you're here today, this Sunday, because we're kicking off a new series today called Tomorrow Today. I think why I'm so excited about this is that I think that this series has the potential to being one of the most formative experiences, one of the most formative series that we've ever done together, especially because of the nature of how it spans the long run. Before we get into some of that, though, I just kind of want to establish some common ground around this series. How many of you have had some experience gardening? Maybe you grew up with a garden. Maybe you just like to this spring. How many of you have some experience? Just show of hands. Like just about everybody, right? If you want to, I just encourage you, somebody that you came here with or somebody next to you that you haven't met before, just lean over and to tell them what it was that you grew in that garden or planted. Just go ahead, right where you are. That's right. I heard a comment. I loved it. Weeds. That's what we grew in the garden. Awesome. I think that one came from my wife, actually. Thanks for that. No. So what we're doing here is just kind of like establishing, right? You plant something in the garden and the cycle. I'm not an expert. I have experience with growing a tomato. I'm not I'm not an expert by any means. But in my experience, the key phase when it comes to gardening begins not as you're like in front of the dirt putting like seeds into the ground. I mean, that's important, don't get me wrong. But at least for me, the planting phase really begins when I go to the grocery store and I pick out what I'm going to be planting later on, right? I've just got some cucumber seeds here. I've got peppers and cherry tomatoes. The planting season, right, begins not with the question of what do I plant, right? The key question when it comes to gardening isn't what do I plant, it's what do I want to eat. As you imagine yourself sitting on the front porch or something in the summertime, late summertime, and you're enjoying a meal of, if you just like picture yourself eating a homegrown salad, you want to move in the direction of planting lettuce. If you imagine yourself like I do eating like homemade chips and salsa, right, then you're going to want to go in the direction of tomatoes, peppers, etc., vegetables. Like, who wants that anyway? Just go for the salsa, right? The question isn't what do I plant? The question is what do I want to eat later on? Now, we're establishing common ground. This is going to sound monumentally obvious, and I hope so. But like, there is a direct relationship when it comes to gardening between what's planted and what's eventually harvested, what's eventually picked, right? Like I said, this is not rocket science. So like think ahead. If you want cucumbers, you plant cucumber seeds. Tomatoes, tomato seeds. Peppers, pepper seeds. Because there's this direct relationship. You could call it, and for this morning, we're going to call it the law of the harvest. The law of the harvest simply says you pick what you plant. Okay, that's gardening, and you didn't come to church to learn about gardening, and you certainly don't want to hear about it from the guy who grew like one tomato in his life. What we're talking about here isn't necessarily the law of harvest as it applies to the garden, but as we're going to go into the book of Galatians this morning, we're going to see that the law of the harvest, as the Apostle Paul writes, actually applies to every area of our life. He uses the language, and we'll read it in a minute, you reap what you sow. In other words, this is a simple like farming language to say you're going to pick what you plant. So caution, word to the wise, choose carefully later on in another season what you want to eat. You just imagine the kind of life you want to have, the kind of person you want to be, not necessarily today, but the kind of person you want to become tomorrow. The kind of, as we're going to see next week, the work that you do. You know, maybe you grew up and you saw in other people, you're at a stage right now and you see people like grinding it out and they're working simply for a paycheck, working for a payday. And you're looking over at that and going, I don't want to do that. I mean, even if I could do something that's highly lucrative, I don't want to be that person who just punches the clock waiting for payday and waiting for the weekend to come. Every single week, in and out. I don't want to be that person. I want to be the kind of person who sees value in my work. I want to be the kind of person who sees like, I'm thriving here and I'm making a difference here. Friends, there is something that needs to be planted now, and we'll find more about that next week, so that now today, so that tomorrow, when it comes harvest time, the harvest will be sweet. When it comes to the time for reaping, for picking, it'll be sweet and not bitter. Financial situation, right? When you look forward in your life, and you're going, someday, especially when it comes to living an open hand versus a closed fist kind of life, I want to live a generous life. I'm not capable right now because I owe $100,000 in student loans or whatever, but someday, tomorrow, the person you become tomorrow is determined by the choices and the decisions that you make today. It's simply the law of the harvest applied to your checking account. Applied to your financial standing. Now, it's tough. It's tough, but some of you grew up watching parents live this cold, loveless relationship, a completely void of affection, and you could tell. And some of you have made promises, you've made decisions, you've made commitments in your heart that's saying, I will not end up like that. I will not be in the same relationship that I watched my parents struggle through with decades. And then when it comes time in year 7 of that stretch, and it gets really, really tough, you have some tough decisions to make. You have a tough choice to make about honoring the decision, honoring the commitment and the promise that you once swore to yourself would be true for tomorrow. If you take nothing away from today, I hope you know that the law of the harvest is true. You pick what you plant, you reap what you sow. That God will use the decisions, commitments that you make today to form the person you become tomorrow. But there's a catch. And this is where it gets tough. Just want to give you an example, right? Because we all know this is true. We see it and we eat it literally every day. But this is where it gets tough. You just imagine two guys. They go out for a coffee together. They've been friends for decades. They hang out like they always do. And it comes time, one of them turns over and says to the other, so are you freaking out yet? And the guy's like, about what? What are you talking about? And he goes, come on, man. We both have kids that are headed to college, and we both know how expensive it is. I've got no plan. Are you freaking out yet? And the one guy is like, it's weird. It's crazy. I know, but 15 years ago, somebody warned me that this day would come. And so I started squirreling away little bits at a time. I mean, it was never very much, and it was always a huge sacrifice. But I gotta say, I'm just so grateful that 15 years ago, just somebody had that conversation, because I'm here right now, I'm looking forward. I mean, I have some reservations, but I am not freaking out. And the other guy's like, man, I wish somebody had that conversation with me. See, both of these guys are experiencing the law of the harvest. They're both biting into the fruit that was planted years ago. One of them, it tastes sweet. To the other one, it's bitter and undesirable. Now, I don't think that the two guys had differing insights into their financial situation. You could use any example. I think they both generally received the same amount of information, except one person chose to believe it, and the other one not. The Apostle Paul addresses this directly in Galatians chapter 6. There's Bibles under the chairs in front of you. The words are also going to be on the screen. I want to point out, though, Galatians is a book written, it's a letter actually written by the Apostle Paul, pastor, to the church in this region, Galatia. It's Kenton, Ottawa County or something like that. It's this collection, geographic area with a lot of different people, a lot of different cities. The book of Acts tells us that on Paul's second missionary journey, he actually went to this number of cities, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. He went to these cities and he started churches there. He started these Jesus movements that gather and collect in people's houses. And then when he's writing this book of Galatians, he's writing to a collection of all of those cities and more, Antioch, Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, all of those cities that identify as the region of Galatia. And he's writing to his open letter to everybody. The reason why I say that is because the two guys, he knows them. He probably knows them by name. I mean, these are cities that he poured into. These are cities that he spent time in. These are conversations that he had until the wee hours in the morning, right? Talking and pleading with somebody to accept the Jesus way of life and to bet everything on the man who came back from the dead. Paul knows them. And so as he's talking to them, I want us to treat that. I think it's really important for us to look at this, not so much as a theological treaty from on high, but more like a friend who cares deeply about the well-being of his other friends. And this is what he says, especially to those guys having coffee, from Galatians chapter 6. He goes, verse 7, he says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows, the law of the harvest. You pick what you plant. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. And we could just kind of go back to that first slide. Do not be deceived. Don't be deceived. In a sense, he's like saying to these two guys, just struggling with whatever decisions they made years ago and reaping the harvest of those decisions, of whatever that it was that they planted. Paul is like saying, you think that like nobody warned you. He would offer, I think, this kind of rephrasing of it. He was like, never underestimate the power that you have to deceive, to trick yourself. Like you think that you're planting cucumbers, melons. You think that you're going to have enough tomatoes to feed like everybody on your street. You think that good things, but if you look at the garden that you're actually planting, you tricked yourself because you never tended to the vegetables. You never looked after the fruit trees. The only thing that you did is watch weeds grow and plant thistles and thorn bushes. That's what you actually did. And so the warning from Paul is to simply tell the church in Galatia and also us today, listen, just be aware. You may think something good is growing. And as a friend, I don't want you to be shocked when you bite into it, maybe years from now, tomorrow, in another season, and it tastes bitter. It's bitter. Because I don't want that for you. Some of you grew up in church, and so you might remember there's something in the Bible called the fruit of the Spirit, right? Fruit of the Spirit, it's like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I think I nailed them all. The fruit of the Spirit. Anybody know where that's found? Fruit of the Spirit? Galatians 5. It comes immediately the chapter, like paragraphs ahead of where we are. What's also in Galatians chapter 5, paragraphs ahead of where we are in this story, is the fruit of the sinful nature. It's like the upside down world version of the stranger reference. It doesn't matter. The fruit of the sinful nature is the bizarro, is like the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. And Paul also lists those off. And it's we're going to read a list here. It might make you uncomfortable. It should make you uncomfortable to hear these things like rattled off in church and like a little bit squeamish. That's okay because Paul is naming it because remember, he's going to get around to saying just right here, don't be deceived. Don't underestimate how easy it is to trick yourself and deceive yourself into thinking these things aren't actually being planted. He says the fruit of the sinful nature, and let's just get the list up here and read them off. The first one, the fruit of the sinful nature is sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfishness, ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgy, and the like. This is by no means an exhaustive list, including, but not limited to, list. Now, like I said, you just look at the list for a minute. And I look at a list like this, and some of them are, but just consider this. We're going to hear in just a minute the fruit of the Spirit. This is the fruit of the sinful nature. In other words, this is like Dirk, void of God's presence in my life. I could say the same thing is probably true in your life. This is like completely absent of like God working on our hearts. This is what we end up as. If we're not constantly planting and tilling and pruning and working on the garden, these are the kinds of things that we're growing. These are the kinds of things that just like get planted and later on we're going to pick it. We're going to reap and we're going to harvest what's growing here, and it will be bitter. And our friend and pastor, the apostle Paul here, warns us. And he's saying, I don't want that for you. It's so easy to deceive yourself. So maybe we would be wise. Just simply look at the list. Look at the list and consider one or two of them that you think, you know what? I don't want to admit it. But there's like something about it that I am drawn to. Like pick one. I'm not going to ask you to write it down. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, just come forward, none of that. But you just for your own mind and for your own tomorrow, what's the thing on the list that you're like, I know that it's toxic. I know how bitter it could grow into. And I know I haven't like seen it, but like the seeds are there and are planted. And I don't want to see what this thing grows into tomorrow, next season, decades from now. What is that thing? Because I look at the list and I see so many on there, and this is just maybe an observation of how easy this is. So many of them are good things like turned to bad, good things twisted into something nasty. I look at the list and I see something right off the heading, sexual immorality. And then look at the list and say, what if God made us as these sexual people and just drawn to each other? Right? And what if there's something inherently very, very good about that desire, about that longing and that connection for another person? Well, what about there's something there that keeps two people in a relationship that spans an incredible amount of hardship and pain and loss and difficulty and joy and celebration too? But what if there's something about that connection that is helps keep us together for the long run? And how that gets twisted is if it gets thrown around and shared with other people, or thrown around and shared with other websites or something like that, right? And then as we go forward, it's like almost we become less human. And our experience of humanity is tightened and constrained instead of becoming more human and having it widened and opened it up to new possibilities and new depths of intimacy. You look at the list. Idolatry and witchcraft. And what if God embedded into this world this sense that there's something more than just what we can see and what we can feel, what we can hear, what we can taste? What if there's something else out there beyond the natural into the supernatural? And what if we look at that and we become so infatuated with that we start worshiping that thing, that created thing, instead of the creator? And we've twisted it, and we've turned it. And someday that thing is going to let us down, and when that harvest comes, Paul doesn't want that for us. And he looks at the list, and he sees things like discord and, in your quest to be right, proving the other person wrong. We look at the things of factions and say, community is such a sweet thing. It's such a good thing. But community turned inward on itself becomes this hiving off, this faction, to say you know what, I'm not just interested in the community and perspective that other people around me have given, but I'm simply only interested in what they say. And I'm no longer interested in what anybody else or what the truth may hold. There's politics in there. And the factions come out. And Paul, the friend of ours, who's a pastor, says, I don't want you to bite into that fruit after it grows for 10 or 20 years. So what's a word? We're not going to ask you to do anything with it, but just something that he's saying, it's going to be bitter. It's not good for me. I know it. But if there's something growing in the garden of my heart that does not belong, it's probably this. And then on the other hand, in the very next verse, Paul turns it around. He goes, but I got to tell you, it's not just that stuff. It's something better. In the next verse, Paul says, but the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of not Dirk's fruit at his best. This isn't you at your best. This isn't double down and try harder and then it can start growing. He goes, no. But the effect that Jesus has on somebody's life, when we give everything, when we hand areas of our lives, rooms of our heart, over to him until it all belongs to him. It's this kind of stuff by God's good, holy, loving Spirit just starts to grow this inside of us. And we just see that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. I learned it as patience, but forbearance is good too. Kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Same game. What's something on the list? What's something on the list that's man, so-and-so in the office next door, I just find them so unlovable. And God, if you would, if you just give me love for him for her. You look something on the list and saying, every time, it happens every day, and I don't know why I'm always surprised, but every time the juice in the far back seat of the van spills, like I lose it. God, if you could just grant me self-control in those moments, I would be eternally grateful, because someday this is going to grow, and someday I'm going to pick what was planted years ago, and I want it to be sweet. If you could ask God to grow one of these in your heart, which one would it be? What would you pick? Now consider this. The God of the universe wants you to ask for it. The God of the universe, the God that we learn about through the Bible, Old and New Testament, is a God who longs to give us these good things. He wants us to pray out and to ask him, God, would you, only by your supernatural possibility, would you grow gentleness inside of me? Would you grow patience inside of me? And God is going to say, yes, just not yet. Listen to what Paul says in the next line as we're kind of running through here. He says this, verse 9, he goes, let us not become weary in doing good. Can we say this together? For at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. At the proper time. God's saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to grow this for you. I promise. But just what seems to always be the case is that the harvest seems never to come in the same season that you planted. Just a totally hypothetical situation. Guy after New Year's steps on the scale and says, well, New Year, 17, let's see where we're at. And he looks at the number and he goes, 232 pounds. I have never been 232 pounds in my life. Something has to change. And so he decides to do something about it, except for that day, there's also a birthday party for his niece or nephew or something. He goes to the birthday party, and there's cake and ice cream and pizza everywhere. And it's like the good kind with the garlic crust and the dipping sauce. Oh, the dipping sauce. And then, everybody is enjoying the festivities and running around. It's a party atmosphere. And he says, you know what? Today, because I'm making a difference, because a harvest is coming and I pick what I planted, I'm going to opt for coffee and coffee only. And the next day, after making such wise decisions, he steps on the scale and sees 233 pounds. And he goes, I could have had cake and the dipping sauce, right? I mean, isn't that like life works? And we're called back and say, and we're seeing Paul call back and say, stick with it. Hang in there. Listen, don't get weary. Don't get exhausted. Don't get tired. Keep the vision of what you're becoming in front of you. You harvest, but almost never in the same season that you planted. One thing as a weight loss strategy is another thing to that person. He looked at his parents in a cold, unloving relationship. It's void of affection, and said, I will never become that. I vow, I promise, I commit today that I'll never be in that place tomorrow. And then years 7, 8, and 9 come. And it is so hard. It is so unbelievably difficult because the person that he loves isn't always the person that he likes to be around. And he has to call back, and he has to remind. And if I could just get with that person and to just gently say, maybe it's you, and just gently look over and say, the harvest will come. But almost never in the season that's planted. Hang in there. Don't become weary. Don't give up. Not now, not ever. God is growing something. The harvest will come. You will pick what you plant later. At the proper time. And Paul wraps it up with this vision. And he gives this picture, about what life could be like. Not just what life could be like for us as individuals, what life could be like for us as a community. He lands it by sharing with us verse 10. He goes, therefore, in light of the law of the harvest, that you pick what you plant, The person you become tomorrow is based on the decisions you make today. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. Let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. I read earlier this week, and I love the line. Well, first, because doing good, it seems so small. Right? I mean, Paul, you are talking about your friends growing up and flourishing in a life in the Jesus way, in a life of the Jesus movement. This is going to be so difficult to them. Some of them will lose their lives to this cause. And you just like, good? Just don't, as you have an opportunity, just do something good. I mean, it seems small, except I read earlier this week a line I love, I'm going to share it with you. Just greatness seems to be little more than goodness compounded by time. What if it's true that greatness isn't much more than goodness compounded over time? I think of, in light of everything that Paul had just said about the law of the harvest, you reap what you sow, you pick what you plant. Tomorrow is determined by the commitments you honor today. And I just wonder about, as you have an opportunity, you have a snowblower and a good back, and your neighbor has one of those. Maybe, go out and help. Right? But nobody's going to give you a medal of commendation for your acts of valor on the battlefield of your neighbor's driveway. Nobody's going to do that, especially if you have a snowblower. They just think you're getting out of like childcare or something. But no, nobody's going to honor you too highly for that. But what if greatness is goodness compounded by good, or compounded by time? You've got a full pantry, your neighbor has none, or there's a pantry up the road that needs help. It's a good thing. It's little more than a good thing, but greatness is goodness compounded by time. That the harvest, what's going to make the harvest so sweet someday, one day, and the promise of God is that it will be, is that the good things that were planted today and the commitments and the promises and the decisions that were honored today over the course of a lifetime, the proper time. Goodness will somehow, over time, be translated into greatness. As decisions get made, habits become formed. Just for us to get on the same page and just see how powerful that principle is that of the law of the harvest that we're reading about. Earlier this week, I read a story in the early 20th century. Is it soon after the Titanic sunk? Everybody knows that story. But soon after the Titanic sunk, it was within a couple of years or so, there's two ships, the USS Monroe and the USS Nantucket, collided off the coast of the Carolinas. And because it was the timing, the Titanic just sunk, and now there's another ships going under with dozens of people losing their lives. The U.S. Congress at the time called a special investigation, and they called Captain Johnson forward to testify on behalf of the USS Monroe. And what they learned throughout that process was that Captain Johnson was piloting his ship with a compass that deviated only up to 2 degrees at a time. It's this tiny margin of error. And in fact, he said it was inconsequential in the scheme of things, and now dozens of people had lost their lives on account of it. And so I would just ask you to maybe consider what's miscalculated. What's a little bit off track? What's off just so much that instead of piloting the ship of your life to exactly where God would have it, you end up on a collision course with, as Paul says, your friend, certain destruction. In fact, I have 2 questions this morning. The first one is, individually in your life, looking at the list of the sinful nature that just seems to grow and looking at the list of the fruit of the Spirit that God grows, what is in your heart that needs to be like rerouted and recalibrated according to true north? God's promise is that He can help with that. Don't give up. Don't give in too soon. The second question is far more difficult. because I can't help but wonder if we as a nation haven't gotten off track, miscalibrated by just a few degrees, maybe less than 2, a seemingly tiny margin of error in one direction. No, friends, I admit, you don't have to find out later, I know my bias. My wife, my father, my family immigrated to this country. The latter group as refugees in a bombed out post-World War II Europe. And the promise that they were given at the Statue of Liberty that they flew over was to give me your tired, give me your worn. Come to me, all you huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That was a good thing. That's a good thing, and I think compounded over time, it turned into greatness. I wonder about the good thing that Jesus has in store for all of us believers when he says in Matthew 25 that a day will come. It's a promise, not a question. That a day will come, Jesus said, when I gather everybody before me, all nations, all peoples, right before me. And I'll put goats over here and I'll put sheep over here. And he'll look at the sheep and say, how righteous you are, my righteousness living in you. Because when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you invited me in. When I was naked, you clothed me. And when I was a prisoner, you came to visit me. And the sheep say to their Lord, they say, Lord, when? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in? Lord, when did we see you naked and clothe you in prison and visit you? And he said, what you have done for the least of these, you've done for me. And so I would just ask you to search the calibration of your heart and ask if it, not if, to ask how. As all of us are sinful and falling short of the glory of God, how this week have our hearts gotten off course by only a few degrees, but a few degrees that could make all the difference between certain destruction and the life, the blessed life that God has in store for us. The promise of God is that he wants to grow these things in us. If we but ask. Stand up and let's ask him this week. Gracious God, reading your word, Lord, we know that this isn't a question of if, but how. And Lord, so we hand our hearts over to you, Lord, because we can't change the world. We can't change our nation. We can't change our city, our families. Not yet. God, we can only, by your grace and with your help, change ourselves. And Lord, it's our prayer this week that by making a commitment, by making a decision, by making a promise to live a more Jesus-patterned life, that, Lord, you'll change us from the inside. And as we're changed, our families change, and our cities change, our nation changes, and our world changes. God, there's something dead inside of us that needs to be raised to new life. And so I ask for the resurrection. I ask for the resurrection not simply as an event in time past, but as a resurrection that is happening now in our hearts, in our lives, in our world. And I ask that the resurrection starts here and it spirals out of this. God, that by your grace, you grow it to a place where people are finding new life and finding new hope and finding new love and joy and peace and patience. And so that the time comes 20, 30, 50 years from now when we meet you face to face as you promised will happen. Jesus, you will tell us that the resurrection was made new in our lives. And we will live with you forever onward. It's in that hope that we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.